Once we go through the presentations, we can then go to the panel discussion to have a bit more discussion on the key things on the initial process of pipeline development. So I think that for most people, one of the key successes of the whole GCF activities is about projects, getting projects that are financed. So in Ghana, for example, you know, people keep asking us, you're doing all these things about capacity building, and yet you have no project to show. Isn't that a failure? Well, that's one way to look at it, but I guess it tells you that project development really is very key. And so the process really of identifying projects also become one that is very, very important and can also, if not done well, derail the whole process in terms of the integrity of the selection and all that was done. And that can really affect a huge risk that can affect the whole thing that you're doing in terms of the project selection and also development. So this is very key. And this presentation really will try to look at the Ghana context in terms of what we really meant by prioritization, what was our focus, what limitations were we working in that regard. The processes that we actually used in Ghana for the prioritization process, we'll have a look at the project prioritization matrix that we developed for Ghana and the sort of decisions around how we were able to put that together and how it was used. And of course, we'll highlight a bit of the challenges in this presentation as well. Right. So really, in terms of context, really we were looking at, so going through a certain process that allows us to come up with a list of projects. Now, we have to bear in mind that this is the context that we find ourselves in at the time of doing this was about working within the BMU funded readiness. And we are told that, well, you have only 2 years for this whole process to do that at a time. So now you are going through a process to identify projects, but you are bearing in mind that, okay, you have a limited time to identify the projects. At the same time, you have to bear in mind that, well, you are expected to develop concept notes out of these projects and also possibly come up with full funding proposal. So this is the sort of context that the mindset that people had at the time that we were doing this. And also we have to bear in mind that we were not doing this with a specific focus on developing a country program, because that was not the focus at the time. The focus was we wanted to have projects that we could send to the GCF. And so that was the sort of context that we found ourselves in Ghana when it came to the prioritization process or the initial screening process to identify projects. In terms of the process itself, I mean, in Ghana, you can look at it in 2 ways, right? The first would be what we probably would call an ad hoc process. This was, if you like, the first step in identifying the projects where we were targeting specific sectors. So there were, if you like, institutional or sectorial level selections that were done. And then out of these selections that were done at the specific institutions or sectors, then you then pass this on to the NDA for, if you like, a more structured, systematic process of then selecting out of these projects that you received a couple that you could then use. Bearing in mind, like I said, the context of this is the BMU, and also you are not going to be able to fund at that time maybe more than 2 projects. So you're looking at, okay, we are doing this and we are just maybe targeting just 2 projects, right? Okay, right. So the first stage, which would be the initial screening at the institutional level. So what then happens is that, so the NDA, well, that is going to lead the process, unfortunately, has not been traditionally that institution that is given the mandate or has been given the mandate to coordinate climate change activities in the country. So here they find themselves in a very tricky situation because you have to bear in mind this is a political minefield. I mean, if you don't make the right choices here, you could step on the right toes and the whole process could be affected because the Ministry of Environment traditionally has been that lead agency that has been coordinating climate change in Ghana. So then in doing that, you really had to work closely with that ministry. So what the NDA did then was that, well, we had to go through a sort of consultation with the Ministry of Environment. Now, of course, that was also good because at that time, the Ministry of Environment was also part of the NDA's Technical Advisory Committee. It was a co-chair, sort of. So they were like partners at this time. And so it was easier to then go to them and say, well, we want to do this. We want to prioritize projects, but we need you to play your role in coordination to be able to get all these people, all these sectors to provide us with projects that we can then select. So the Ministry of Environment, with that in mind, contacted these other, if you like, sectors using a letter to ask them to provide them with specific projects that in their institutions were priorities. Now, of course, in Ghana, this was easier because you had the NDCs already gone through a certain kind of first stage prioritization, which basically identify key sectors, about 7 sectors that climate change was going to be focused on. And therefore, it was easy to target those sectors. But then, of course, they were also then looking to make it a bit more inclusive. So then they went beyond these sectors and also targeted specific private sector organizations to provide private sector, if you like, projects where they could then also leverage financing from private sector institutions. So they would then also provide them with project ideas or concepts that also would allow them to be able to do that. And these institutions were then able to do their initial screening and then select projects. And then based on that, they were able to submit projects. At that phase, the first phase, we ended up with 19 different projects that were then submitted to the NDA. So then we moved to the second phase. And at this second stage, this is where you actually then go through a process of then screening using a tool to be able to then select the projects. At the time that before we went through the process of getting the projects from these sectors, we had already developed a certain kind of tool or matrix that was supposed to help them. Now, the whole concept or the whole rationale behind developing the tool was that, well, the NDA and the Technical Advisory Committee didn't want a situation where they selected projects and then it became like, how did you arrive at these projects? What was the basis for selecting project A and not project B? And so they then needed to have a system that provided some bit of transparency so that then, based on what they do, it would be easier for other people to also verify and say, okay, this is the steps you went through, and that it is clear that this is how you arrived at these projects, and therefore if another person does something similar, it's possible that they might also end up with something similar or even the same type of projects that you go through. So this was very important that they had something to guide that process. And so the tool really, to help them do that, had specific features. It was important for the NDA in the development of this tool that they didn't have the same sort of criteria for both mitigation and adaptation because, I mean, let's face it, they are both targeted at different goals. There are different objectives for climate change mitigation and adaptation, so it wouldn't have been fair in the mindset of the experts who did this and also, of course, from the Technical Advisory Committee to have the same kind of criteria for all projects at that time. So they had to have a guidance that provided that kind of ability to do that. And so they also had the guidance that helped them to be able to score each of the indicators or criteria that they had in the project. So in terms of mitigation, for example, they had what they call the criteria-based matrix. Basically, it identified 7 key criteria or areas that they could then be able to judge each project based on. And as you can see there, you had impact potential, paradigm shift, et cetera, et cetera. For each of these criteria, each of these ones, they had to then go on to be able to establish specific rating and also weighting for each of them, right? So for example, if you take impact potential as an example. So the tool helps them basically to define what they are trying to do in terms of impact potential. So here they are talking about potential to contribute significantly to the reduction of emissions. And then based on the project idea and in terms of CO2 emissions that would then be reduced, they are then able to then define whether to classify this project as a very high project or high or medium or low or very low or no impact at all. And the same thing applies for all the other criterion that is found when it comes to mitigation. And so what will then happen is that you really wanted to find the rating for each of these impacts and also the weights. So before they even start the process, the tool provides them with a default weighting for each of these, if you like, set of criteria. And then they are then able to, before even they start, pair the project, the technical advisory committee with a panel of experts are able to then decide whether they are to keep with the default rating or that they would have to adjust these weightings. But of course, this would require consensus to be built in terms of arriving at what sort of weighting to give and also in terms of the rating based on the level of, if you like, CO2 emissions, etc., that was going to be reduced. And so in all, the scoring would have to be done, first of all, by an odd number of experts. Now, the reason why they use an odd number of experts is that there will sometimes be situations, and it can happen. It has not happened so far, but at least they foresee that there's potentially a time that maybe you're not able to build consensus, right? You can't arrive at the same conclusions, and therefore you may have to put things to a vote. And when it comes to that, then an odd number of experts would be useful in that. But when it comes to deciding on the weighting and et cetera, it's the whole TAC that will do that. But then when it comes to the actual scoring, they will then choose a number that is an odd number to actually do the scoring in that regard. And so, of course, the summation of the criteria rating and then the weighting will then give you the score for each of these projects that you would have. Adaptation also had another criteria. So in terms of adaptation, the basis really for using the multi-criteria assessment was that you wanted, if you like, a method that was capable of integrating a lot of diversity in terms of criteria. You wanted a method that also could do things, integrate impacts on non-monetary values. Okay, that allows them to be able to then assess things not based on specific values that are placed on things. So, for example, you see the criteria that they are focusing on things like the political climate that is related to that kind of project, institutional implementation barriers. They are looking at socioeconomic. They are looking at whether it is also environmentally friendly. And these are the things that they are looking at when it comes to the adaptation multi-criteria assessment. And for that one, what they basically do is that they need to score based on a specific rating that they give out of 100. And then also they give weights to each of these criteria. So a summation of the scoring for each of the projects or criterion, and also that of the weighting that they give would then help them to be able to score. And then based on that, they're able to rank. And a similar thing goes in for that one as well. They also use an odd number. In terms of decision making, after the projects have been selected, for what we did, I mean, with respect to the BMU one, so basically they identified 2 key projects. But before they trimmed it down from 19 to the 2, basically they had to come through some agreement. So for example, they decided that, well, we have 19 projects, right? But some of them have the potential of gathering finances beyond GCF. So what they did was that if they identified projects that can on their own gather external financing without GCF financing. They decided not to include it in this phase of, if you like, funding for GCF, right? So they focused on the ones that they felt, well, it would be difficult if we don't have the GCF to be able to fund these type of projects. And these were the projects that they focused on, and then they were able to then rank them and then select the ones. And out of these, they got one mitigation and one adaptation project. And once they identify the projects, they then, as I said, the Technical Advisory Committee really is an advisory committee. It doesn't make the final decision. So it advises based on what they've gone through, and then they made the recommendations to the NDA or the focal point of the NDA. And then he then also, of course, based on the information he has, meets with the management, senior management of the Ministry of Finance, and then they decide on what to do with that kind of decision. And after that, of course, they are also able to then communicate to those projects that were not, if you like, selected, to be able to then help them to see what the next steps or the next phases are in terms of those kinds of projects. And it's good that we have the Ministry of, the Ministry of Finance as part of the decision-making process, because he's a cabinet member in Ghana, and a cabinet member in Ghana has a lot of political will, and therefore he ensures that there's a lot of political buy-in, if you like, when it comes to the selection of projects. And so if you have such a cabinet member, then it makes it easier to push projects within Ghana. In terms of the key challenges of this process or initial screening, so, I mean, as I said, I mean, consultations are key for buy-in. I mean, yes, the NDA could have decided that they are the NDA and they just want to do it by themselves, right? They could have done that. But because they were able to get a lot of people involved, either through the Ministry of Environment and also through the TAC, it was easier for them at any point in time that there's a backlash on why you had these projects, that, well, they can point to the other people within that sector and say, well, they were part of the process. And they also identified that, of course, there's evidence to show the ministry actually wrote to us and we provided them with projects. So this sort of thing was helpful, and it was a good kind of evidence so that politically they were really covered in that regard. One thing also is that the sectorial screening obviously runs the risk of not being as transparent, even though, of course, you are talking about a process that should be transparent. At the sectorial level, what you do is that you made a request to them to submit projects. But as to how they went about that selection, it's really something that is still in the dark, because at that phase, you really didn't know how they came up with those kinds of projects. Your assumption is that once you send it to the ministry or to that sector, they would also then identify projects that they think helps them to meet their policy objectives as a ministry or as a sector. And therefore, that should be the focus. I mean, that is, of course, in the real world, in an ideal world, that should be the situation. But of course, there's always a risk there that maybe somebody can decide that, okay, this is a project that I think I like, and I think it should move, without necessarily going through a certain kind of process to determine whether or not it is a key priority within that particular sector. So that is a real risk there in terms of that kind of approach that was used. A lot, as you saw from the use of the tool, depends on expert judgment. A lot of the things will have to be based on the judgment of experts within the TAC, and sometimes, of course, the TAC also, depending on the type of project, maybe if it's an energy project or a water sector project or agriculture project, they would invite key experts within these type of areas to be part of the panel that does the kind of scoring, or even be part of the TAC. So, of course, at the end of the day, the result really is as good as the knowledge of the experts that really are involved in that process. The criteria in the tool could also obviously benefit from a bit more broader stakeholder input at this stage, because yes, we went through a process where a consultant contacted key sectors, but it didn't have that kind of broader stakeholder involvement, because here we are talking about priorities of the country, not just priorities of just a small section of Ghana. So it's important that that kind of criteria really is subjected to a bit more, if you like, stakeholder involvement and input to be able to make them a bit more national in terms of context. And it's clear, really, a prioritization from what we've seen in Ghana, and anybody who was part of that process, is that it really takes time. I mean, to even send letters to the ministries and to get them to send you feedback on the project, that took almost about a month to get that done. So, that alone gives you, in terms of context, amount of time that is required to be able to do that kind of work. So these are really good points. I think that really is going to shape Ghana in the way forward, especially when it comes to now that we are requesting for extra financing from the GCF to be able to do a country programming, because then we can learn a lot from the process that we've gone through to be able to make sure that this is more inclusive and also are able to provide us with the actual priorities that we want to take forward as a country. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back again on the stage, and with more lights. Last chance. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm presenting on the GCF pipeline process in Nepal. As mentioned earlier, in the past 100 days, we don't during this process of project evaluation, we didn't actually evaluate a certain project, a proposal, but what we were able to do is, I think we kind of garner a process of how we can do a project evaluation or proposal evaluation. So a lot, as I mentioned yesterday, we've borrowed a lot of things from what Ghana is doing or what Ghana was doing then. And so if you look at there's some similarities of our approaches. So I'll just talk about briefly on the project development process, the application, the evaluation process, and then I'll focus on the challenges and lessons learned. So as a part of our project outcomes, I think we have basically had to deliver two project proposals, for two bankable proposals to submission for GCF. And so when we had this output, we basically, the NDA was very insistent on doing it a more transparent and open method rather than kind of securing, because as you kind of have heard that we had two entities that had applied for accreditation, and the discussion then was whether to support the two entities to support in proposal development or kind of do an open call. And so when this discussion came about, the NDA was insistent that let's do it transparently, let's do it openly, let's just make them call, let's ask the two entities to also apply to submit a proposal or project idea. So that's how this, the NDA has been very vocal in terms of making it very transparent. So based on this request, a national call was issued. There was a project guideline document that was shared with everyone on the national document. And the document basically, this was basically for a project idea. It was not for an entire concept of using GCF's concept note framework, but basically a simple project idea of that gives a perspective of who would be the accredited entity that you'll be working with, what's the project objective, what are the impact areas, who are the beneficiaries, but it's in line with the concept framework template that GCF had. So we're kind of making it a kind of simplified format so that's easily understandable, and it's easy for whoever is applying, is easy for them to kind of share a project idea. But what we kind of highlighted there in that kind of guiding document was that the project concept must be in line with Nepal's climate priorities and policies. The project must also align with the GCF strategy impact areas and investment guidelines. And then third, identify the possible implementing entity. It either be a national implementing entity or international. But in case of Nepal, since we didn't have a DAE, the argument was let's open it for the international entity to also kind of work with the national institutions to apply for the concept note. So this was the basic framework that we endorsed, and once we moved ahead with the process, we had about, I think about 19 applications for 19 concept notes or project ideas to evaluate from. And so based on the proposals that we received, we worked with UNEP, who had worked on the criteria rating for Ghana, shared a format that we kind of thought would be applicable for us. But in the discussion with the NDA during that time, there was a lot of confusion about the rating scale. I'll go that into the next slide. But this was basically a kind of a stepwise process of how we've done it. If you look at the idea, once the call was issued, then we had 3 stages. The first was the initial screening. The initial screening was done by the Climate Finance Unit. It was supported by UN Environment. And I was also involved with the screening process to kind of give guidance to the Climate Finance Unit. Then once the Climate Finance Unit reviewed the proposed concept project ideas and screened the proposals, this was then forwarded for the stage 2 evaluation, which is done by the technical committee or the technical unit. And this was also supported by UN Environment. And the final is the stage 3 was about the technical decision that was up to the NDA to decide on, based on the recommendation provided by the technical committee, whether to take that forward or not. So this is the kind of a stage-wise process that was adopted for the evaluation of a project idea during a project scope. So in terms of screening, as I mentioned earlier, the criteria that we had set is basically a screening criteria for all the proposals of the 19 proposals. We looked at, the Climate Finance Unit looked at whether the proposal was in line with national priorities and plans. Then it also looked at whether what are the strategic impact areas that these proposal kind of addresses, and also the investment guidelines, how do they address them? And third, we looked at the entities. Are they working, who's the implementing entity for that particular project idea? So in some instances, there were project ideas that were brought about by an NGO, which is at a very small scale, for like 300,000. So those proposals, what we did for the initial screening is that we kind of capped it at any proposals less than 10 million. We'll shelve it we'll park it. We won't take it further into evaluation, but we'll park it. But if it's a project idea, we'll ask, the UNEP was given an authority to kind of review those proposals at a later stage, but not in this selection process. So what we wanted to do is, among the 19 proposals, we don't want to reject all of the proposals at once. The proposals that qualified or met these 4 criteria was taken forward. So among them, I think had around 8 proposals that we considered were technically qualified or passed the screening process. The remaining were parked so that the policy pipeline consultant who was supposed to join us at a later stage would come and review those proposals and see whether we can either blend them, because some of the proposals were very at a small scale. So if you're looking at a proposal idea that is similar in terms of renewable energy, to combine those projects and make it if we can make it into one concrete proposal. So those proposals were parked, the remaining 8 were taken forward. So in terms of, once the proposal was forwarded by the Climate Finance Unit for evaluation, the rating criteria was based on what I think Ayirebi has mentioned. It's similar to what Ghana had used. Kind of a training was, we had a couple of discussions on the rating score. How are you rating it? How do we justify, how do we give an entity the proposal a 5, a full score? How do we give 1 score? So this was it was a very kind of iterative process of discussion of kind of coming up to a score. And in the end, I think we kind of agreed to a score rating in total of 100. And then we looked at each of the 3 components that we had kind of prioritized. So one of the criteria that we use is the project must be in line with Nepal's climate policy and plans. So those proposals that addresses especially the NAPA documents, especially the climate change LAPA instruments. So those proposals were prioritized and given a higher score. Similarly, if you look at this impact, how does that proposal address the strategic impact areas and the investment guidelines of GCF? So they were given a separate weighting score. And the third criteria was based on if the project was based on activities that have been implemented in the previous, earlier. So any projects that were implemented already done at a small scale, for instance, through another fund, and this is going to be expanded to a larger scale project, or basically a replication of a smaller scale project, then that would be prioritized more in terms of implementation. So our perspective was that since Nepal, as a vulnerable country, we looked at adaptation as a more priority then for these process rather than mitigation. So for us, grants was a priority. for us, adaptation projects was a priority. But adaptation project that had something in a range of above 10 million to about the rate of about 50 million. So that was the idea of when we did the project selection. So when we did the rating score, as Ayirebi mentioned, some of the ratings that we've done, we've given them a score of no relevance to excellent, but this was all done on a consensus base. It was not because what you have to remember is the members of the technical committee are not experts on the relevant subject. They're not experts on climate change. So what we relied heavily on is we had the Ministry of Environment delegate who was there as part of a member of the committee. So whenever we come up to a score, we kind of discuss why we're giving the score, what's its justification. For instance, if you look at the number one criteria, if there is, whether the policy kind of, whether project idea looks at national climate change policy, the NAPA document or the LCTs, does that kind of project idea addresses any of these criteria? So if there is a non-relevance, it is given a 0 score. But if that project proposal had a component on these policies, then they were given an excellent or a scoring of, I think, 40. Similarly, same cases with the other criteria. I'm not going into detail of all of them. For example, for the case of proposal that was selected for IUCN, which is based on kind of a scaling up of an ecosystem-based adaptation intervention. So this was a project that was funded by BMU in I think in 2012 to 2015. This was a project that was implemented by IUCN, UNDP, and UN Environment. So the project idea that they had brought about was kind of basically upscaling at a larger basin level, a practice of ecosystem-based adaptation in that entire basin. So it was a large-scale project that met the policy requirements, that met the GCF investment criteria, and then that met the building on the existing work that we have done. So if you look at these criteria, and if you look at, I mean, it's not very technical. It's not very something that was based on a discussion with the members, kind of coming to a consensus and agreeing to a score. And also, what we have to remember is also the scoring that we did. I think we relied heavily on the expert judgment of the people, but it's also about understanding the context of what type of projects we are funding, what type of project we are giving an approval to. So for us, I think reviewing these, I mean, kind of giving a judgmental aspect of coming up to a decision was largely not based on like a technical scoring criteria, but rather a kind of a matrix that kind of relied on based on consensus. So in terms of the decision, we basically, the technical committee agreed to, I think there were 4 proposals were endorsed by the technical committee, which was forwarded to the NDA. Among the 4, the promoting transformative climate resilient agriculture. So this was one by FAO. It was endorsed for, was the first proposal that was supported and which UNEP provided support to. Then the other proposal was with IUCN, which was basically to kind of an upscaling of the ecosystem-based adaptation project that I mentioned earlier. And the other criteria that we had was that they needed to work with the line ministries or line agencies. So if you look at the proposal that we've received, that IUCN had prepared and the one that FAO had prepared, either the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development were engaged in the process of developing the concept note, or they were engaged as an E for this concept note. Similarly, same case with CRA as well. We made sure that the Ministry of Forest was engaged in the entire development of this concept note. And then NTNC was involved later on, but not at the immediate early stage. So based on this, these are the 2 proposals that was endorsed. Just to give you a status update, the NTNC proposal, the IUCN proposal is now, has been reviewed. There are comments back, sent back to IUCN, who are now kind of responding to those comments. And it will most likely go to the January meeting. The FAO one is still pending, but I think they're doing a thorough kind of review of the entire proposal that was prepared. SCMOD is kind of providing support to do the technical review of the proposal. So they're targeting for not the January meeting, but the next. So So that's the kind of scenario. And both these proposals are supported by the BMEB funded readiness. So that was kind of that was kind of a process that we adopted. So in line with, as I mentioned yesterday, that we need a guidance, we need a framework for the NDA to kind of highlight what would be the process, what process needs to be adopted if you were trying to make a decision on proposals. So that was one of the kind of hands-on exercises that they were implementing, but that was not on proposal selection, but that was more on project idea review and selection. So this is the process that the NDA has adopted. It basically follows up through what the practice did, right? So they do a national call, they do a shortlisting, there's a review. Once the review is done, an expression of interest by the NDA is issued to that particular entity. Then the full proposal development goes through. Once that goes through, then only the no opposition letter is issued. So this is the entire, that's a national kind of step that has been followed. And it's in case of all the proposals that we've received. Some of the proposals that we received has gone through the same process. So any proposals that the NDA receives goes through a review by the technical committee. The technical committee can invite additional technical experts because the NDA committee, as I mentioned earlier, is not a technical expert on that particular area. So if it's a mitigation project or if it's an energy project, then the relevant energy person is brought into the technical committee and gives an expert opinion. Based on that, they take it forward. But I think what we don't have, or what we're missing, as Ayirebi mentioned, is we don't have a separate criteria for evaluation for a mitigation and adaptation project. That's something that we kind of missed. And the reason we kind of didn't thoroughly prepare that is because we were not evaluating a full proposal then. And so based on this discussion, what UNEP has done prior to the closure was that they basically looked at the criteria for evaluating funding for adaptation and mitigation proposals. So in their report, in their final output, they have shared a criteria for evaluation of adaptation and mitigation project for the purpose of bankability of a project review. So that's a report that has been submitted to NDA. The NDA has not yet still kind of taken full kind of, they have not taken fully on board the recommendation. So that is something that we hope we'll take forward with the GCF readiness, GCF funded readiness. So in kind of coming to the challenges, I think for us, as I mentioned from the past 2 days, I think the NDA has been very strict on transparency. So they wanted the process to be very open. They want people to know about what the processes have been adopted, what is it for. So they've been fairly open on this. And the nationals, for instance, so the national call was issued on a national daily. The information about quality of selection and non-selection was informed through the national media. So that has been the process that has been adopted, which has made their task very easier. And it's also, like I said yesterday, once you have this transparency kind of open, you kind of give them a mandate or give them a guidance on a certain process, it makes their decision making easier. So when they did the call, the evaluation of proposal, they were not interfered, or there was no political influence on any of the decisions that they made throughout this process. The second one is efficiency in review. So if you look at the decisions that are made in terms of proposals, in Nepal, it's always like, as I think someone mentioned yesterday, someone knows from someone. So it always happens that there's certain influence on certain proposals. And so when the proposals come to the NDA kind of, or the Ministry of Finance sends that proposal to a related ministry. For instance, if it's a water project or energy project, that proposal is first reviewed, comes to the NDA, and then the proposal is sent to the Ministry of Energy. So that process has been adopted for a long time, and so that time it kind of takes a lot of time to kind of review the process, come to a decision. So what we were able to do with the committee that we have is that make it much more easier. Bring all of the experts together on a room, sit down together, discuss on the proposal, see whether that makes sense to kind of endorse that proposal, and then come up to a decision, recommend to the NDA, then NDA makes a decision. So it kind of smooths, kind of improves the efficiency of how the proposals are reviewed and how the decisions are made. So for us, this has been, we've worked to ensure that this kind of process remains. And like I said yesterday, they're trying to do the same thing with the GCF proposals as well. So not just come up to the NDA and then kind of get an approval, but go through this process of review within the committee and then come to a decision. Similarly, I think the ownership, I think as I mentioned earlier, some of the proposals that was sparked was also because that they didn't have a national coordination with the line ministry. And so what we have been able to do is any proposal that's developed, since now, as I mentioned yesterday, we have gone through, now we have a provincial government. So it's important that whoever develops a proposal, be it international entity or a national entity, they have to have a consultation and coordination with the provincial governments or the national governments or the government line ministry. So if those entities are there, then the NDA kind of reviews the proposal. In case it's not there, it's not reviewed. So this mechanism has also been set up. The other aspect of it is the need for engaging DAs. I think I've said a lot about this. For us, I think it's important. It's not only because we want the DAs to be involved as a kind of push for GCF to show that the DAs are involved in this proposal process, but also in kind of building the capacity, because we expect that DAs is going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources to kind of train them to develop a proposal. So the capacity of, if you look at NTNC and APC, NTNC is more advanced in terms of proposal development right now rather than NTC, because they understand the context of how you defend your investment or how you link the strategy impact area of GCF to the proposal. So they are more aware of this. So they have since they worked on the proposal. So we've ensured that the proposals that have come, for instance, the UNDP proposal on GLOF, in the early stages, they were not engaged with any of the direct access entities. But after discussions, I think they're trying to get APC on board to the proposal development process. So we've tried to engage them, make sure that the DAs are involved in this process so that it kind of enhances the capacity. It also gives them a kind of a uphand in terms of once they go to the review, then the GCF kind of sees that the DAs are involved in certain aspect, either not as a implement entity, but as an EE. And the last one, I think I mentioned earlier that the tool that we've developed is not comprehensive. It's a tool that's based on judgment opinion of the experts that we have in the panel or in the technical committee. But what we are hoping is that it kind of redefining the tool. We have that already, but it needs to be adopted by the NDA. So we're hoping that in the next readiness, we will get that in place so that we have a more defined tool for reviewing proposals, concept note and proposals. So I think that's about it from my end.